Welcome back. I hope your lunch is good. We're going to get started today with Brandt Stickley from, you still in Portland?
Yep.
Still in Portland? Apparitions of the, actually, let's settle this.
Yeah, let's do it.
Aperspectival, aperspectival.
I'm aperspectival.
Aperspectival.
Me too.
Because you know what? I want it to be like something you can bite into.
All right. Brandt, thank you.
Okay. I was really, so actually in contrast to Dave, I, would you believe, a few days ago read something that said, presenting at an academic conference, it is an insult to your audience if you do not have a written paper. So we have here a written paper, and it's a little more personal than it's been in previous years. It's considerably less academic, and it is. And I toyed with the idea of not having any images at all, because I want you to visualize what I'm saying as I'm saying it, if you can. And it's all about the breath of life. And it is expanding and contracting. Expanding and contracting, like your blood vessels are right now, like your digestive system is now, like every thought that's coming into your mind emerges from nothing, comes into being, goes back to nothing. It might go through a cascade of fantasies before it does. But eventually, there will be a catabasis as it returns back to its origin. There's been a continuous trajectory, an intensification of my engagement with the ever-present origin and the thought of Gebser. It has been nothing short of an eruption of synchronicity upon synchronicity. Throughout it all, the theme of my exploration has been precisely the concretization and actualization of the manifestations of the aperspectival consciousness, and how to bring these to fruition in my life. Primary amongst the many concepts that I find uniquely articulated in Gebser is time freedom. Time freedom has been a clarion ringing in the whole of my experience. It was like the lightning-like flash of the spherical dawning of a wearing of the whole. It is, as such, an aesthetic experience. I mean by that phrase its true etymologically rich meaning of relating to the perception, or by extension sensory. Gebser notes in Invisible Origin that sense is one meaningful translation of Tao. By using that term, I intend to open a dialogue in this moment, this present, as the future blooms like a longing and the past like a current flowing through the vessel of now. I invoke time freedom within the channel of attention. Wherever she alights, a transparency opens. In Mandarin, the word for open is kai. but it's often used to mean to give a full functional impulse to something. Thus, in common parlance, one says, kai che, open a car, for driving a car. Kai dung, open a light, for flicking on a light. Or even more significantly, to kai guang, literally open brightness, which is to invest an object such as an amulet or a statue with presence. I open a transparency as a felt sense. I open feeling. Opening. I wake to the reality of the stream cascading through my being, emerging into expression, birthing forth as the living breath of life that sparks into being from naught, continually, ever presently. I feel that sense as the concretion of time as my body, and the concretion of freedom as my perception, and my aesthetic sensory body as the manifestation of those presences in time. I recognize the total moment, the origin itself. The itself of origin is time freedom. Time supersession and time concretion emerge when, quote, we consciously realize the forces surging toward awareness and achieve time freedom by our awareness of the differing forms of time. The eruption of the origin in experience is nothing other than the opening of the very transparency that emerges as a quality of the spontaneous bursting forth of magic timelessness, mythic temporality, and mental conceptual temporality. In their own modes and signatures, wending, mycelial, rhizomatic, connected, composted, scorched, catalyzed, dismembered, renewed, reborn, reincarnated, resurrected. The slings and arrows of outrageous fortune that carved the pathways for light to blast through. Like sprouts emerging, like the force that through the green fuse drives the flower. Veriditas, in the language of Hildegard von Bingen. O most noble greenness, rooted in the sun, shining forth in streaming splendor upon the wheel of earth, no earthly sense or being can comprehend you. You are encircled by the very arms of divine mysteries. You are radiant like the red of dawn. You glow like the incandescence of the sun. It is the simple shining forth of essence, a necessarily overflowing primal water of spiritual depth, that in its ineffability always exceeds the grasp of the mental rational desire for closure and category. Confounding, as Bergson states, it is of the essence of reasoning to shut us up in the circle of the given. And reasoning on its powers, will never succeed in extending them. If the spiritual is the diaphanon and the transparency is diaphaneity, then the quality of the spiritual is its diaphaneity. Not only light illuminating darkness, nor day's dawning cleaving the night, but darkness visible via light, darkness visible via a light within. Or like the classical Chinese term for the ineffable or mysterious, xuan, is described in the first dictionary of Chinese language, the Shuowenjiezi, black, but with the color of cinnabar. This is mystery. For now I see through a glass darkly, but then I shall see face to face. Time freedom is the visage of awareness. Turn to the enveloping wholeness of the incipient face of life-affirming judgment. The etheric body of the conscience as a state of sensory knowledge. Tomberg, in Meditations on the Tarot, shout out to the Monterey Jung Society. Tomberg, in Meditations on the Tarot, says, quote, "In the passing beyond the intellect, it is a matter of choosing between the decision to replace the intellect once and for all, and with the breath from above, and the decision to place the intellect in the active service of this breath. In the moment that transparency illuminates itself as a transcending quality of space, that brightens the hitherto dark, unknowable depth of slipping beyond contact with the mental rational, it is the quality of its light and clarity that enlivens the coniuncto oppositorum of discursive intellectuality and illuminative spirituality. Or in other words, it is the alchemical work of the union of human wisdom, which is folly in the eyes of God, with divine wisdom, which is folly in the eyes of man, in such a way that the result is a single wisdom which understands both that which is above and that which is below. Direction emerges, ascent and descent, and where light is an emanation, the concretion of time emerging as direction gathers as a generation of being, and the integral cognition of generation is simultaneously present. Ascent takes the form of rising up towards heaven and descent moving towards earth as immediate waves of resonant vibration. Prayer rising, revelation descending, complete a circle which contracts and concentrates to become a point where the ascent and descent are simultaneous and coincide, providing direction to the directionless, yet allowing the directionless to exist within all directions, perceived as vascularizing intensities of simultaneous and luminous presence. If we perceive history in this way, it becomes integral, says Gebser. That is to say, I invite history to include both direction and the directionless, divested of temporality and its sequential nature. On this I make the whole of duration an altar, and on it will resurrect the mutations of the ever-present origin as an offering. A mention is the presence of origin, upon which the light shining from a pewter chalice becomes a cobbler's emergence into the spontaneous spherical poiesis of the cosmos. Sophiopoiesis, poe Sophia, demanding a Sophiology. In 1610, Jakob Boehme experienced a vision prompted by the reflection of light from a pewter dish, an experience he described as being brought to the inward ground or centrum of the hidden nature. In his prodigious and visionary literary output, for which he was declared a heretic and banned from writing or participating in liturgical life, Boehme articulates a multivalent understanding of Sophia as incarnating in the Blessed Virgin Mary, as an embodiment of the Holy Spirit in contact with terrestrial life. Indeed, as an animating principle of all that is, a kind of feminine parousia both with and of God, as a manifestation of Godhead but not identical to God. Gebser references Boehme's experience in his discussion of the history of the phenomena of the soul and the spirit as an example of living knowledge that must be brought into embodiment. Quote, whatever we can understand on the one hand, we must sense or experience on the other. This sensing or experience is the living knowledge required to complement our calculative, estimative knowledge. Without this process and achievement, no life is capable of achieving conscious integration. Gebser's living knowledge is one aspect of Boehme's portrayal of Sophia as the force contacting the soul that, quote, tinctureth its dark fire with her rays of love, pictured in alchemical language as the rushing toward awareness of the whole aesthetic being, in a catabasis that is nevertheless a bursting forth, out and forth of the sensate or sensitive substance of the spirit, Or also, in Gebser's words, transparency, diaphaneity, is the form of manifestation, epiphany of the spiritual, and that transparency which is a quality of volition. This remarkable recovery of the feminine face of the Godhead in post-Reformation Germany is yet not without precedent. It is an irrepressible eruption of the divine feminine resonating like an echo, a call and response to the descent into the deficient mental, rational manifestations of the Protestant Reformation. How much further have we fallen into the technological descent into hell in our own age? And what can arise now? Burma's vision of Sophia was consistent with that found in scriptural sources. In the text Wisdom of Solomon, quote, "Wisdom, the fashioner of all things, taught me. There is in her spirit that is intelligent, holy, unique, manifold, subtle, mobile, clear, unpolluted, distinct, invulnerable, loving the good, keen, irresistible, beneficent, human, steadfast, sure, free from anxiety, all-powerful, overseeing all, penetrating through the spirits that are intelligent, pure, and altogether subtle." 7:22-24. In the voice of Solomon, Sophia is presented as a teacher of such power as to be a fashioner of all things, and yet with a quality of contact as intimate as a spirit. According to Burma, Sophia is the power of the glory of God, which hath shed forth itself in the creation, in all created things, and lieth in every thing, according to the property of the thing. Hidden in the center as a tincture in the living or animate body. For she is a breath of the power of God, a pure emanation of the glory of the Almighty. She is the reflection of eternal light, a spotless mirror of the working of God, an image of his goodness. Although she is but one, she can do all things, and while remaining in herself, she renews all things. And again in Sirach, "From the beginning, before the world, was I created, and unto the world to come I shall not cease to be, and in the holy dwelling place I have ministered before him." Sophia as origin, where origin, from which every moment of our lives draws its sustenance, is by nature divine and spiritual. Quote, "They are latent in origin, they are always back leaps, so to speak, into the already ever-present future. Origin is itself time freedom, and time freedom thus is by nature divine and spiritual, hypostasized in the agency of Sophia wisdom, perhaps even a manifestation of the, quote, more intensified Christianity predicted via the dawning of the Aperspectival by Gebser on page 530 of the EPO. This is entirely consistent with Burma's understanding of Sophia, as Michael Martin describes, as both agent and immanent, quote, transformative being, as both a property and condition for receiving grace. On another token, and even more specifically indicative of Sophia as time freedom, is the likening of Sophia to a looking glass, that is, spontaneous patterning of the whole, the medium through which non-being, the abyss, emerges into being with the bis, or ground. For example, in this virgin of the wisdom of God is the eternal principle as a hidden fire, which becometh thus apprehended as in a looking glass in its colors, and hath been known from eternity to eternity in the figure, and also thus becometh known in all eternity in the eternal original in the wisdom. In a late paper specifically discussing parapsychology, Gebser describes the integral realization of time, not a sequence of past, present, and future, but the interplay of the three aspects that make up the essence of the pre-existing whole. To preclude any misunderstanding, we would caution that the word pre-existing in this context should not be given a deterministic or fatalistic sense, just as the term the whole must not be understood as postulating a form of neo-monism or holism. Pre-existing refers to the pre-existent structure that always includes potentialities and consequently an element of indeterminacy. Burma's influence has been profound, influencing Blake, as well as the mystic Philadelphia Society in England, poets like Novalis in Germany, and of course Jung himself. As a simple example, we note how, quote, the archetype is itself empty and purely formal, nothing but a facultas performandi, a possibility of representation which is given a priori. Ultimately, Burma's influence finds its full Sophianic register in the developments of the Russian Sophiology of Soloviev, Florensky, and Bulgakov. Soloviev is the poet, theologian, philosopher who had the greatest influence on bringing a distinct Sophiological tradition into being. In a manner of speaking, our attention will be addressed to limited aspects of Soloviev's oeuvre, the experiential and poetic aspects of his legacy, which ultimately drove his theological and philosophical thought. His relatively short life was marked by 3 remarkable visionary experiences that he understood to be encounters with the divine Sophia, the first at the tender age of 9 years old. Later, a vision, while researching in the British Museum, accompanied by the words, "Go to Egypt," prompted the journey that resulted in the crowning encounter in the desert dawn. In an autobiographical poem, the poet describes the resolution and immediacy of his answer to the echo of his encounter with Sophia. For a moment, place this pivotal relation into the integral and achronological context. Time soars away on wings of inconsequence. Though yet immersed in the diurnal flow of dark and light, from this gradation of light and shadow, yin and yang, an outward arc of the journey towards Sophia travels out into the dark night of desert silence. Yet prompted by a voice in the confines of the library and in the dawning of the light in the person of incredible beauty of the eternal friend, there is yet a dark and nascent inward turn from which arises yet again the philosophical body as imaginal and experiential assemblage, body as oeuvre, light from light, light from dark, dark within light, begotten, emerging, of one being as becoming. In Gebser's winter poem, the shining winter sky is close enough to touch, and you are to this sky. No reason to distinguish, for all the stars flow through your veins, writes Gebser. Quote, one meets the Blessed Virgin inevitably when one attains a certain intensity of spiritual aspiration, when this aspiration is authentic and pure. The very fact of having attained a spiritual sphere which comprises a certain degree of intensity and purity of intention puts you in the presence of the Blessed Virgin. I was called in to cover a clinic shift for a colleague. Students on the shift apprised me of the cases we'd be seeing. One of them was a young woman in her 20s, a college student returning to school after a hiatus owing to some difficult and frankly traumatic experiences that significantly disrupted her life. There's a certain feeling when seeing a patient for the first time, with the awareness that they will very likely be the only interaction one has, and of course that she will continue in the capable care of a colleague. Really, though, this amounts just to an impetus to get it just right. The pulse, as I've previously shared, provides the most sensitive and exquisite insight into a patient's experience, in this case informing my touch of the blows to self-confidence and the fullest possible expression of being, what I call the Taiyang life in this person, the difficulty of returning to center under duress. The therapeutic principle in such a circumstance is to promote as much as possible the flow of blood circulation so that a person truly feels the fullness of her blood flow. The amazing thing about Chinese medicine is precisely how it is a medicine of blood and time, and how concepts as simple as blood itself refer to the literal substance and yet also spiral into almost infinite reaches of the imaginal realm. When I needled the point inner gate on her wrist, she experienced a buzz of electricity down her hand and up her arm. Later in the treatment, I settled into the manipulation of a needle at the point called guest house. This is an interesting point. The term guest, bean, itself harkens back to oracle bones, and thereby to the guest host paradigm of spirit offerings attested to in Proto-Indo-European society. And what a guest arrived. As I was needling an image of the Blessed Virgin, Stella Maris, Our Lady Star of the Sea, appeared above the patient, with stars arrayed above her. After a moment, I asked the patient, "Do you still feel the sensation in your arm?" "Yes," she replied. "What does it look like?" I asked. "Look like?" she asked, slightly puzzled. "Yes, if you could see the feeling, what would it be like?" After a moment, she said, "It looks like stars. It looks and feels like stars flowing through my body." After witnessing this, naturally, students inquired about its meaning, and our discussion ranged from Stella Maris to her shared iconography with Isis, the later marine and lunar associations in the Hellenic period of Isis, as well as the suffering of a mother or a lover, literally cradling the dead body of her beloved or child. Somehow the lunar aspects struck us, and it was upon returning to charting that I realized her name was Selene, or Celine. After sharing this with the patient, it was clear she had awakened to a renewed experience of her place in the stars. On synchronicity, Jung says, synchronistic phenomena prove the simultaneous occurrence of meaningful equivalences in heterogeneous, causally unrelated processes. In other words, they prove that a content perceived by an observer can at the same time be represented by an outside event without any causal connection. From Sophia, now we can turn to the connections between the divine Sophia and the Blessed Virgin. Soloviev, like Berman, entertained fluid connections between Sophia and Mary almost as a function of his poetics, and this reached greatest expression in the Russian inheritors and interpreters of Soloveyev's work, Florensky and Bulgakov. Although having different relationships to Orthodox thought, Sophiology continued to find expression in their work. Bulgakov, whose views on Sophia especially led to censure and charges of heresy, in particular concerns us, as one concept that he espoused relates to the argument I am developing regarding time, freedom, and synchronicity. This is the view that Sophia is the ousia, the substance that is common to three persons of the Trinity. Tomberg further elaborated on this. Tomberg was a Russian esotericist whose strong interest in Steiner led him to become involved with the Anthroposophical Society, only to leave it later and ultimately embrace Roman Catholicism. Can I get a time? 5 minutes? Great. Steiner, in fact, predicted that the 20th century incarnation of the future Maitreya Buddha would be born in 1900 in Russia and come into contact with the Anthroposophical Society. So some have suggested that Tomberg was this very incarnation. One of Gebser's avowed manifestations of the aperspectival world, alongside the time freedom, diaphaneity, and the recognition of energy, all of which we've addressed, is the supersession of patriarchy. I understand this at one point as one point of entry to the renaissance of Sophiology, and that is precisely through a recovery of the feminine dimensions of God within a Christian milieu, as Jeremy mentioned yesterday in the Doctrine of the Assumption. Tomberg effects this gambit. First, he aligns the woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet and her head a crown of 12 stars of revelation, with the act of uniting the three luminaries, the moon, sun, and stars, that is, the luminaries of the night, day, and eternity, effectively also unifying this image, per Gebser's treatment of light as spiritual symbol, aspects of the magical, mythical, and integral consciousnesses. In this context, Tomberg elaborates a dual trinity comprised of Father, Son, Holy Spirit, with Mother, Daughter, Holy Soul, and describes this view as not a matter of seeing the Holy Trinity with human eyes, but rather of seeing with the eyes and in the light of Mary Sophia. Not seeing the integral outside of us, seeing through the integral. Not seeing the integral as an archetype, seeing through the integral. Yet we have fire ascending and earth descending in one image. The image of the two triangles in a star, a Solomonic hexagram, Star of David, represents the redemptive realization of the real via Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and the luminous reaction or animation and positive assertion, the yes, of Wisdom Sophia, which echoes the yes of the Blessed Virgin as well as the union of fire and water mentioned by Jung and the union of above and below as revelation and prayer. I believe that this point itself is the intensification of Christianity that Gebser predicted, the return of the feminine to a Christian, intensified Christian context. It's thus that we turn to the two phenomena which correlate to the same period of the broad emergence of the aperspectival: Marian apparitions and UFOs. I feel that I must reiterate that those who affirm the irruption of origin from latency, quote, are already the co-creators of aperspectivity, conspiracies are so magical consciousness. Well, he offers the example of miracles at Lourdes, a healing spring that emerged through an apparition of the Virgin Mary. Gebser elaborates on the magical space-timelessness of the magic structure. The primary argument is the immersion in a state of union and the descent into a cavernous lack of differentiation. The example suffices to illustrate the incursion of structural elements into even present experience. But it also demonstrates that the essence of the arcane, the occult, could become transparent if we could perceive such phenomena irrationally and not approach them rationally or permit them to mislead us irrationally or allow them to overpower us pre-rationally. Since the time of the apparition at Lourdes, however, there have been an increasing number of apparitions. In fact, as recently as 1966, by the action of Pope Paul VI, quote, "One cannot incur ecclesiastical censure for frequenting places of apparition, revelations, visions, miracles, even those not recognized by the ordinaries of dioceses or by the Holy Father." Similarly, appearances of UFOs have also increased from the earliest reports circa World War II. Jung was collecting reports of these phenomena from 1946 and, of course, famously wrote about the flying saucers as modern myths of things in the sky. Gebser remarks upon Jung's work in his Reflections on Psychology in Part 2, Chapter 6 of the Ever-Present Origin, in which he says that, quote, "From the standpoint of aperspectivity, nothing has been surpassed or superseded. It is a psychological attempt which is impossible to carry out at the concretion of the spiritual, and that it is inhibited as a psychological framework from becoming an effectual spiritual element." Yet in his assessment of the UFO as archetypal image, Jung suggests that in their roundness as God image and archetype of the self, in their roundness they are a God image and archetype of the self. Like the spring which erupted at Lourdes, many of the apparitions have produced clearly miraculous artifacts. The image of the Virgin of Guadalupe on the tilma of Juan Diego, which has remained uncorrupted for 400 years, the chapel of Our Lady of All Nations in Amsterdam, photographed images of apparitions at Zaytun, and many more. Dozens recognized by the Church and countless more unrecognized. Likewise, recently the news has again intensified regarding alleged sightings of unidentified aerial phenomena by Navy officials. Perhaps the most significant Marian apparition of the modern era, one observed by over 70,000 witnesses, also shares a significant number of qualities with unidentified aerial phenomena, as documented by researcher Jacques Vallée and treated in a number of texts. Confounding as these experiences prove to be to the mental rational consciousness, and as enticing to a pure appeal to the magical or mythical may be, Gebser is clear that the phenomena truly invite the emergence of the aperspectival. In so doing, he reiterates again and again that this transparency itself is the diaphanous and the concretization of the spiritual. One unassailable aspect of the phenomena that join UFO contact and Marian contact is the irrevocable change in the perceiver. Can I have like one more minute? It's no less true that the increase in these phenomena also accompanies the descending catabasis of the mental rational technoculture and the destruction effected by its chaotic overreach and totalizing mechanisms of control. Further still, the manipulation of media and the creative production of imagery become the fertile terrain for the confounding of mental rational faculties. Yet, as Gebser suggests, these invite a perception of space-timelessness and its pre-causal structure, or consciously emergent space-time freedom. Closing shortly. October 13th is the day that the miracle of the sun occurred at Fatima. After months of apparitions and the 13th day of each month, a final apparition occurred before tens of thousands. In the midst of a relentless storm, first the clouds parted, the sun appeared and hung like a great silver disk that one could look at directly. The sun began rotating, whirling, careening through the sky, then stopping, emitting brilliant rays across the sky, increasing in size, plunging towards the massive crowd, then ascending to its normal position. The muddy, rain-soaked ground and the bedraggled crowd were all perfectly dry. Skeptics and cops. Skeptics and cops were prostrated and weak, and joy lit up the faces of all. As we approach the 13th ourselves, this Sunday, may we discover the miracle of finding within ourselves the emergence of, quote, a liberation which can only be completed via the awakening consciousness of the spiritual, and advance the work of the alchemical confluence body, spirit and soul, radical perception of the whole, where transparency opens to itself, and in a directionless direction manifests its Sophianic flow beyond the confines of the mental rational and into the life-affirming circulation of time through its own emergence as our bodies, and its dynamic energy intensifying into the acquisition of an intensity where the ascent of our aspirations and the embodiment of our latent potentials merge into one sympoetic transmutation of the origin as creative inceptual basis. Thank you.
I think we have time for maybe one question. Robin, do you want to come? Okay.
Well, I'll just, what of the dark feminine?
I was going to start by saying I'm going to totally ignore the dark feminine. Well, but that's not true. So it's always there. In fact, one of the facts of this, for example, one of the aspects of the dark feminine that we could align with Our Lady of Fatima is precisely that there was a number of prophecies that were delivered via the apparition, one of which remained secret, and was communicated to the Pope. And he later spoke, the Pope, Pope John Paul II actually said, in revealing it, that all Christians should be content in the knowledge that the oceans will inundate whole continents and millions of people will die from one moment to the next, was the final secret of that apparition. That's always there. Again, the catabasis, the descent into hell, is always there. The divine is present. I mean, earlier we were talking about Christ and Antichrist, and we were talking about Christ and Lucifer. Lucifer historically identified as the morning star, Christ literally saying, I am the morning star. So if I can hold Lucifer and Christ in the same tone, I can hold the divine feminine and the dark feminine in the same tone. And if I can see that as simply manifestations of yin and yang, I don't see manifestations of yin and yang. I don't look for manifestations of yin and yang. Like Picasso said, I don't seek, I find. And so I look through yin and yang, I look through dark and light, I don't see them outside. And that's the transparency, is the awakening of consciousness to see through those structures as the seeing itself, which I recognize we can understand that as a cultural phenomenon, but my argument is only through attention to the physical felt sense of the embodiment of that awareness in our being are we ever going to actually awaken to live into the integral perception. I believe that is the project.